Hey up! Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Leeds Digital Festival. And today, Northcoders, we are going to present a round of lightning talks from 3 different individuals across our campus. And that's what we're going to do this evening. Hopefully, you're all as excited as I am to hear what everyone has to say. We've got some interesting talks lined up, one from me and 2 other people. Yeah, so if you don't mind, I'll get started. So I have a fantasy football team. And one of the things that causes me crippling self-doubt every day is whether or not I've made the right choice and whether I've picked the right team. So I wondered if I can use some software development and a little bit of maths to help me and your fantasy football team. So for those of you that don't know, what is FPL? FPL is where people pick Premier League footballers and they create a team of 15 players. They have a £100 million budget. You need 2 goalkeepers, 5 defenders, 5 midfielders, 3 forwards. You get 1 transfer each week and 1 captain each week. As you can see, my team are the Bamford Cortinas. And one of the things that causes me instant regret every week is picking my captain. So I wouldn't be able to model all of the potential choices that we could make in an evening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simplify the problem. So I'm only going to focus on my captaincy choice. Captaincy choice is very important because each week you select 1 person to be a captain and they can earn you twice as many points. So what I did was I generated a list of 20 captains from the previous Premier League season, and I got the most valuable players. So what most people do is they pick 3 to 5 players in each team because there is a budget, so you can't have a team of all-stars. And I thought I would stick with those as my potential captaincy choices for the entire of the season. So when it comes to choosing your captain, there are a few options out there. You can set who your captain is at the start and forget about it and never change it again. You could, if you're not reading into any statistics or just going off gut, you could pick randomly. You could have a look at the player's form. And for the purposes of this, form is the amount of points they've scored in the past 5 games. And you could look at the fixture that they're playing in and say, is this an easy fixture or is it a difficult fixture? Now, for us, the Fantasy Premier League provides us with what they call a fixture difficulty rating, which is a number 1 to 5. So if it's important enough to put on their website, I figured it was good enough for a metric. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a pool of between 3 and 5 potential captains from the ones that we showed here. And then I'm going to loop through each game week, and I'm going to pick a captain for the week based on one of these 4 models. And then I'm going to sum the points over the course of the season that they would have scored. And then I'm going to do that 10,000 times. And what that's going to do is it's going to get me some data that's going to show potentially which of these methods is the best or the most efficient to help me make my decision. So what I did was I plugged this information after I created a couple of algorithms to decide by fixture and by form and randomly. And then I plugged this into to Jupyter Notes, which is run using Python to create some box charts for using Python's Pandas API. And what this shows is on the boxes, that shows where 50% of our individual performances lie, and then the whiskers are where the rest of them lie. Those circles that you can see are outliers, so they fall outside of a particular range So it's particularly unusual that they are in there, so they're mapped differently. And what we can see is that if we set and forget, then there's a much broader range in that 50% between 25 and 75. And the median, which is that green line, is significantly lower than the entire range. So if I just pick my captain at the start of the season, I would likely fall in that green line, somewhere around there, certainly within that box. If I pick my captain at random each week from my pool, then we can see that the 25 to 50% range is significantly smaller. So I'm much more likely to hit inside that range, but there's significantly more outliers. The green line's also slightly higher, which means that on average, you're probably going to be better picking randomly than you are from one at the start of the season and then moving on. But if we look at the fixture, what my algorithm did was it went through my list of captaincy candidates and it looked at all of their fixtures. And if they all had the same fixture difficulty rating, it would pick one of those at random, based on whoever had the easiest game. The average is significantly higher, and the results are just much closer together. If you look at the bottom line on the graph as well, even at worst, we're doing better than both set and forget and random altogether. If we have a look at form, those boxes are really similar. Okay, slightly higher median, much more consistent in terms of the results because the whiskers are significantly shorter. So what I should probably do is think about maybe doing a combination of those things. Yeah, so that's what I did. So I looked at this final one, says pick by fixture, yeah, because that was the smallest range, and then by form. So rather than picking randomly, see which players arguably playing best and go from there. So the results again higher, and this represents an extra 350, 370 points per season, which is something not to be sniffed at. So who should I pick for the Bamford Cortinas this week? Now, you won't be able, the numbers are quite small, but my premium players are Lukaku, Salah, and Alexander-Arnold, but he's injured. Maybe Antonio. If we look at their fixture difficulties, Lukaku is playing Brentford, and Antonio is playing Brentford, Lukaku is playing Southampton. So those fixtures are very similar. And then if we look at their forms, we can see that Lukaku is putting out significantly better numbers, hitting 5.7 points per game. So I should probably pick Lukaku. Now, the models that I've created today aren't showing all of the data. There's lots of things going on at the same time. Chances of injuries, things like that we don't show. Should we substitute out players based on whether their form is particularly low, all of those kind of things. But the results do see, we can see that using a little bit of maths and statistics, I can farm out some of that decision making, some of that instant regret, and follow a set procedure, have a look at the fixtures, then have a look at the form, and hopefully by the end of the season, the Bamford Cortinas will be at the top of the league. That's it. Thank you very much. Hopefully you found that interesting. I know that any FPL managers out there will be furiously looking at the statistics and trying to find out what they're going to pick this week. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
I do have some questions.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, would you ever use that sort of logic when you use chips in the game? I need a wild card in a second and those. Well, because we haven't looked at a wider model of things like making transfers and even the full starting team, I couldn't do it using the models that I've done today. But I do think if we extended the problem out and looked at who we should pick for our team in general and what transfers we should make based on stuff like form, I think there's definite stuff we could do with modeling to show when a team is underperforming or we've got a series of really tough fixtures and it might be worth using wildcards. So yeah, for the record, for anyone listening, I'm currently second from bottom in the Northcoders team. This is a direct result of my poor performance.
Next question.
Cool. How risk averse are you? Lots of outliers in some approaches and less in others. Interested to risk reward profiles. Generally speaking, because I'm testing out this formula on large data sets, you can see that the whiskers on the box are really wide. What I'd be really tempted to do is have a look at my algorithm in general and come up with some different ways of modeling the data and putting in the captaincy decision to see if I can bring those outliers down. But you know, even if you set and forget, there's still a chance that you could come out on top, and the data showed that. So mostly I picked it so that I can't regret. If you have a decision that you always have to do in a certain way, then you're not too far off. What made you opt for Python? So I understand that Python is really good for large data sets and data manipulation. But I was reading an article on the Jupyter Notepad thing, which is really interesting. That's what the screenshots of the graphs have come from. And that works really well with Python for displaying things like box and whisker charts and things like that. So I chose that specifically because it was a really interesting UI and fun to play around with. And I'd definitely be interested in doing some more stuff with that.
I think that's all the questions. Yeah.
Right.
So,
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. We're going to take a short break while the next person gets set up. And we'll go from there. Okay, cool. Duncan's ready to go. Okay, in that case, we'll go straight over to Duncan.
Cheers, Jim. I'm currently showing us. There we go. So I'm just going to talk a bit about this idea of like personal data online. We all hear about it, but what does it actually mean? And how can we actually have privacy? So I'm sure we've all seen these kind of notices, and they pop up everywhere. You know, cookies. Do you agree to this? Do you agree to that? You know, sign your life away. And you know, sometimes, to be honest, it is just quicker to say, you know what, I'm going to accept this just so I can get straight to the website that I want to look at. And anyway, who has time to read like a 10-page privacy policy? It's much quicker to just accept and take the consequences they come. But what actually is collected? So just an example, here's a few things that Facebook collects about you, about your data. So, you know, nothing too weird at the moment, just the usual sorts of things. Where are you? How old you are? What sort of education have you got? But we then sort of get into something a little bit, well, it gets a little bit weird, just to say the least. Some very specific things. So, you know, users who are friends with someone who has an anniversary. That's very specific. Users who use coupons. Mothers divided by type. Now that is a weird one. And also users who might be receptive to offers. So why is this sort of information collected? So first of all, it's meant to be for using for tailored advertising. So, everyone's seen them. Products recommended for you based off your interests. It's a very sort of common sight. Not always accurate. Sometimes we just get things advertised to us that we've already bought. But it's easy to see why it might be accepted for them to want to know about you in order to have more appropriate advertising. However, there are some slightly more ethical issues with this kind of thing. I'm sure we've all heard of Cambridge Analytica. There was a big story on that a few years ago. Now, Cambridge Analytica made use of, this is a very sort of simple breakdown, but they made use of a Facebook quiz to collect data from people who took the quiz. However, not only that, but they managed to get data from friends of the user, friends of the person who took the quiz, which is really quite worrying, to say the least. This was all without their knowledge. And this data was then used to sort of tailor ads to people in order to influence an election. So, sort of speaks for itself, really. But yeah. So, I suppose, is there anything we could do about that? Unfortunately, just by sort of signing up for a website like Facebook or any sort of social media, you're sort of agreeing to let them know all about you. That's kind of just something you've got to accept, unless you just flat out deleted your social media, which in this day and age is not the easiest thing. There are some other things you could do. You could look at your ad settings, and when you're asked for permission with your cookies and things like that, there's usually an option to just sort of opt out of this sort of personalized data gathering, to opt out of these sort of advertising cookies. And then if you want to go all the way, you can make use of VPNs to hide your location. There's all sorts of browser extensions you can use to protect your privacy. But yeah, so this issue is an ongoing one. Some people are more bothered by it by others, but personally, I find I try and balance it. I like using social media. I like connecting with my friends online. But there are steps you can take to protect yourself, protect your data if you're not comfortable with that. And I think these are some sort of useful links for anyone interested. You can sort of see which companies are collecting your data. You can then opt out if you wish. If you've got ad personalization set up on your Google account, the second link it's quite interesting actually. If it's set up, you can see exactly what they think they know about you. Sometimes it's bang on, sometimes it's really wrong, but it can be very interesting. And finally, there's a link at the bottom for a site that sort of makes it easy to opt out if you should so wish. So I think that's it really from me. Bit of a short one, but is there any questions?
Thank you very much, Duncan. That was really interesting. And it's also really interesting to see two different implementations of data analytics. One to show something as simple as FPL results, and one to show data gathering on such a large scale in Facebook. I do have a question for you, which is this idea of data privacy is obviously very big, and it's something that I think is very important. But do you have any ideas, really? Because sometimes it feels a bit like talking about data privacy to software developers is a bit like preaching to the converted. Is there something that we can do? Should we take personal responsibility and spread the word of data privacy to people who are less technically involved than us?
So yeah, I'm fully aware that I am sort of preaching to the choir here. Like, we know what's going on, but you know, some people don't. So I think I'm not suggesting some kind of campaign against this data harvesting, but even just like a simple sort of information, easily accessible information on like how this data is gathered, what it's used for, and just making it really nice and easy to sort of opt out of this kind of personalized advertising should they so wish.
We're talking about the ethical responsibility of software developers like ourselves in making users aware of how we're using their data. Really important. Very, very interesting stuff, really interesting stuff. Do we have any questions from online? So Lucy Ryder asks, "Hi Duncan, do you accept cookies, or as you are more in the know, do you often reject them?"
So unfortunately, you can't just avoid cookies completely. There's always sort of, you'll often see whenever you're asked to accept cookies, they might say these ones are sort of like mandatory, like we need these, but there's usually an option. It might be hidden sometimes, it's a bit sneaky, but there's usually an option to opt out of these kind of like personalized cookies used for advertising, and I do usually opt out of that, at least when I'm not in a rush.
Nice. We've got another question coming in from Dave Rydalge. Do you feel as though it's the responsibility of users to protect themselves to keep the services free, or should companies be made to keep fewer data points on us?
Yeah, it's a bit of a toss-up really, isn't it? Because obviously there's no such thing as a completely free service. The money's got to come from somewhere. And a lot of sort of a lot of these sort of like online services, they really rely on the advertising revenue to sort of keep going. So I think personally, I'm very uncomfortable with the amount of weirdly like exact data that they want on you, just so they can like really tailor that advertising for you. It sort of makes me a bit uncomfortable, really. But as long as there's sort of like a clear option to opt out of that, then, you know.
Sounds like
Yeah,
there's a real balance to be struck
it is, yeah.
between the company and the users. Really interesting question, Dave. Thank you very much for that. So if we have no more questions from YouTube, then I think that's it. I just want to thank you again, Duncan. I give you another quick round of applause, and then we're going to move over to our final lightning talk of the night.
Cheers, Jim.
No problem. Pleasure.
Do you want to just switch over?
Yeah, we can switch over.
Let your laptop on?
I'll have to leave that there because it's got the Northcoders singing. There you go.
Okay.
I'm showing my screen now.
Yes.
Wonderful. Let's just make sure I have the correct end of the stick. Art by machines, present. Perfect. And change slides. We'll just change it through here. Perfect. Hello, everyone. I am Val, and I have forgotten my key cards. Jim, would you be ever so kind? Perfect start. Thank you very much. My lightning talk, I decided to center it around this idea of art done by machine. And it's a topic which has been broached as an idea for many decades now, but it's really been only in the last few years to a decade where we've had the computational power to really do something quite unprecedented through machines. So I decided to sink into the rabbit hole that is artwork produced by machines. Let's start with a brief discussion of what art actually is. I've put a couple of definitions on this slide, and I want to highlight a few bits that made an impression on me. The first one is just from a quick Google search, literally typed what is art into Google, and this is what it came up. And it made an impression on me on how the expression or application of human creative skill. So Google specifically highlights that for art to be counted as art, it has to come from a human. Now, that poses to me the question, does that mean that machines can have their own creative skills and imagination, but that does not count as art in and of itself? And afterwards, I dug a little bit deeper around this idea of defining what art is, and things didn't become exactly clearer. I went to Oxford Dictionary for some inspiration, and we had on there's probably about 20 different definitions of it. I've included the first meaning and the seventh one. So here in the first one, the emphasis is very much on expressing the need to express, or the imagination to express feelings, in particular in painting, drawing, and sculpture. The seventh one I found really quite interesting, which is the ability or a skill that you can develop through training and practice. And within a lifetime, there is only so much training and practice that a human can do, and compared to what an AI can learn within even minutes of analyzing previous artworks and so on. So defining things doesn't entirely make things clearer. So let's try and break things down. There's a few different types of art that I would like to mention as I was digging around. This concept of different kinds of arts has originated since the dawn of humanity, and I've included here an artwork of the 9 muses within Greek mythology, and the definitions of how many arts there are vary depending on who you ask. For example, Encyclopedia Britannica says that there are 9. Well, says that there's 8, but some other sources say that there's 7, even 10, and so on. These are some of the ones which I've listed on this slide here, have been agreed for most of them, and I want to highlight how graphic arts has now been defined as its own right, not only as a subsection of visual art. So that was quite interesting for me. I've included a couple of images here. The first one is a rehearsal for the performance art Carmen by Opera North that's coming to Leeds in October. And the second image is of architecture, art as architecture from Leeds Central Library. So art can be really rather varied. There's some modern types of art that have come about in the last decade or so. And the image that I've included here, I do apologize if it makes you a little bit uncomfortable once you know what that is. This is a magnification of a Petri dish, and the artwork is done through microbes and bacteria. Different kinds of yeasts are also known to produce beautiful colors, depending on what kind of chemicals are injected into them. And I have, like I said, this is a multi-layered and very varied rabbit hole of artwork that I have stumbled into. There's been all sorts of really interesting things happening within the sphere of bioart. There's also, I wanted to highlight futuristic art, which centers around specifically recycling old electronics and machinery, as well as light painting and kinetic art, or which specifically focus on moving installations. So it's not something passive as a painting where you go and look at it and it's pretty much the same from every angle. Depending on the angle that you take, or the artwork itself might move. Now, jumping into more specifically art that can be done by machines, or where machines certainly have a much bigger impact on the finished piece, I wanted to maybe start with something a little bit more traditional, like what you might think originally. And I'm going to include the name of the human author, as well as the name of the machinery which has produced the artwork, and the different type of projects and certain discussion points that can be made around those. I wanted to highlight first Damien Borowick, who has created the drawing machine. And it is this machine that presents like quite a big metallic frame and a pencil or a pen, which are mediums traditionally used by artists, are plugged into the frame, and then the frame moves at a particular pace, at a particular rhythm, and it creates the most satisfying straight lines and corners. Not even holding the shift key on a digital application brings such satisfaction of seeing this machine in action. And this, the drawing machine itself has been commissioned by companies of the caliber of Samsung, Dior, and BBC to create artworks for different advertisements and different projects that they've been working on. So moving on, I had to include this one. The collective Obvious has, which is the 3 people that I've listed on the screen, has trained up this AI. The signature of it, you can see just beneath the painting, which has become the most famous artwork it has created. It is the portrait of Edmond de Bellamy, which was sold for $432,500 at an auction a couple of years ago. And this artwork was created after the AI had studied 15,000 images on WikiArts of portraits of men. I would like to say men within Western Europe, from the 14th century to the 19th century, and then it had a go at making at least one version of it on its own. And this was the outcome. And the predictions for this for the sale price of this artwork was between 8 and 10,000, and people were already saying at the time, no, that is way too high. It doesn't look much like it's just so blurry, and then the whole thing blew up. So I really had to include the obvious collective here because of the questions that their creation has posed. There's been a lot of controversy around it, not just because of the price of the artwork, but also because they were later on questioned on whether they were the developers and creators of the AI itself. That aside, I would like to highlight another visual artist, Pinavan Arman, and I hope I am pronouncing it relatively correctly. His machine, well, a series of machines and iterations of machines that he's been creating throughout the decades, firstly started off just as assistants, paint mixers, or just helpers to provide paints and provide like the more generic brushstrokes, which he's been interested in. But since then, I'm going to quote, "My machines have grown beyond being simple assistants and are now effectively augmenting my own creativity, as well as having creativity of their own. They have become a generative AI art system so sophisticated that it has forced me to consider the possibility that all of art is generative." And this creator, he has scripted the AI and the machinery that he is using himself. So from a mere assistant, he's now saying that he has to work around and perhaps even alter his own creativity around the creativity of the AI he's created. Another very collaborative project or duo, if we want to think about it in these terms, I want to speak a bit about So-Gwen Chung, who takes turns to paint with her giant robot arm. And to me, this image really quite spoke to me because when I was growing up, I kind of grew up on all these films that speak about giant robots which are going to completely dwarf us and this post-apocalyptic universe. And here is So-Gwen Chung having a painting session with this machinery quite a few times her own size. And the artwork that they're working on is indeed a collaboration. The AI, which is controlling the robot arm, is responding both in color and form and placement of the brushstrokes to her own, and that affects her own brushstrokes, which then in turn inform the following paintwork by the AI. And they create quite abstract artwork, but there's a few more realistic pieces as well. Moving on from a purely visual arts, I want to also highlight the work of Katie Kwan, and the two images that I have are from her website, from her project called Output, which was done in collaboration with ThoughtWorks just a few years ago, where this robot that you can see on the right-hand side is her dance partner. Katie Kwan is tracked through motion cameras. She is wearing a suit, so the contrast between her clothing and the background is quite important so that the AI can pick her motions and respond through movement, through light, through changing the song or the tune of it or the beat of it, and being quite an effective dance partner. And Katie Kwan has been creating these installations and choreographies with machinery, which I found really quite interesting. But she has been really heavily involved in the creation of the AI behind the robot itself. The final project creator human AI I wanted to highlight. We will again end into a quote, which I found really quite interesting. Holly Herndon is raising an AI as you would a child, and just reading on her personal page, I did find that she speaks of the Spawn AI as her child, which is being raised on a particular style of songs to then later on produce its own songs, including the background music as well as the voice. Now, these are mimicked, well, not necessarily mimicked, but these are inspired by another artist, Julie Laplace. And the song Godmother has been the one which has been highlighted as the ultimate creation of this Spawn AI through being raised on the songs from Julie Laplace. But the song itself, now usually using AI is for a song or to generate music or to generate even voice is not necessarily something that is new. But what struck me as interesting here is the fact that the song Godmother was created from silence. So there was no direct input of edits or samples or overdubs as the AI was creating the song itself. And the quote I wanted to share with you is, I find something hopeful about the roughness of this piece of music. Amidst a lot of misleading AI hype, it communicates something honest about the state of this technology. It is still a baby. It is important to be cautious that we are not raising a monster. And that was quite an interesting one to me. I want to finally speak about intent. And I want to finish with another quote from Dylan Friedman, who is a researcher of AI-generated art at Google, who is saying that truly machine-generated art without any human intent behind the scenes doesn't exist as of yet. And that is indeed true. All the projects that I have found so far, a human not only has to script the AI, not only has to build the physical machine if one is needed, not only has to provide the samples and pick the topic and so on, a human still has to have the drive, the intent, the desire to create artwork. And so far, purely machine art does not exist because there is always a human who presses the play button. Thank you very much. And I am open for your questions.
Yeah, fine. Thank you very much, Val. That was really, really interesting. Unfortunately, I couldn't get a full view of the art, so I'm going to have to hassle you for the slides afterwards.
If I'm still sharing, James, I have. I have a full page of references, so all of the, and I'm happy to share those with everyone interested, because some of these projects are so interested, much more so than I can speak about in this evening. But yeah, sorry, any questions?
just so interesting, like when I heard the title of the lightning talk, I thought that it was going to be about, you know, the fractal art that you see that's generated by computers, or like the beauty that you see in like mazes that are created by algorithms. But it just completely blew my mind. Really interesting, really great to see the things that we can do with AI in creative endeavors, not just around you know, understanding data about understanding
And predicting who your next captain will be.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's the most important decision of this week. Do we have any questions from online? Okay, so Dave Radash says, do you think machines can be thought of as artists, or is the true artistry found in the engineering skill of the human defining the machine itself as the art?
through the projects which I chose to look into the most, because this is truly almost an endless endeavor, really. The humans who had created the AI and the physical machines have always thought of themselves as creatives, not only as engineers, as designers, as developers, but also as creatives. And many of them were already into different kinds of artwork themselves. So the first few artists I showed were into painting themselves or drawing different visual arts. Katie Kwan is a dancer, she's a performer, and the final one that I mentioned through Holly Herden, she is also a musician in her own right. But what she's saying is that collaborating with the Spawn AI has allowed her to expand to express herself in ways which her own voice do not allow her to do so. And I think that whilst the machines can't be thought of as the sole artists, they're definitely co-authoring the artwork which is being created. But the engineers and the designers, the developers, they are the main driving force. They're the ones who provide the intent. They're the ones who provide the necessity and the drive and the desire for the work, for the artwork to exist in the first place, because the machine in and of itself can facilitate it, but cannot develop it on its own. It is indeed the human who received. Yes, it is the obvious collective who received the payment for it. Now, it's interesting that you kind of mentioned that, because I'm not actually certain whether the people who comprise the obvious collective are artists themselves. So I just want to highlight that. That would be interesting for me to check later on.
Cool. We have got one more question from Mike Simmons in response to the previous question, that he totally agrees. And would we say that parents are responsible for the change of human? At what point is the relationship? Is that the relationship between us and AI? It's really interesting, following up from your Spawn AI, where that artist said something very similar. What do you think about that, Val?
I think it definitely depends on the artist themselves, or on the developer and engineer. Holly Herden is thinking of the Spawn AI as her offspring through the name, and it is a baby that she's raising on particular kinds of music and musical interaction and so on. But if we start establishing this parent-child relationship, then comes a point where the child surpasses in certain ways the parent, or even if they don't surpass the parent, they need to be treated in their own right as an individual. They mature, they grow. And Holly's highlighting how at present we're not at that stage yet. We're still training up the AI, but perhaps that growing process is happening throughout the world as we speak, with different artists making use of the AIs. But there's also many other engineers and artists who don't think of the machinery in the AI as their child. They think of them as a collaborator, or purely as a machine, as a soulless equipment that facilitates their own creative art outflow. So it's a very interesting topic, and I don't think many artists would have the same opinion.
Nice. One more from Emily Bennett. Do you ever think it's possible for AI to truly ever make art with a complete lack of intent?
Personally, I do not, because for me, art satisfies an intrinsic need to express yourself, whether that be an ideology, a thought, an emotion, a concept, and that desire to communicate outwardly through dance, through spoken word, through a visual form of art, even through architecture, needs to originate from somewhere. And until we can teach AI to have intent and to decide to do things in its own right, not because it's 9 o'clock and it's scripted to give you a reminder to check your emails, for example, until then, I don't think we can have art purely by AI.
Really interesting. I think that I often tell people that as software developers and people who work in tech, some people from the outside see it as somewhat of an engineering kind of thing that we're doing. But in reality, we are creating software. We're creating structures and architecture and, algorithms that in themselves, to me, it feels like I am sculpting with clay. So for me, part of my job is also my creative outlet, which is really interesting. And honestly, thank you so much for that. Such an interesting, really interesting enlightening talk. And I think that's about all we have time for this evening. So I just want to say thank you to both Val and Duncan for providing us with some... And me, thank you. I can't thank myself for some really interesting lighting talks. I want to thank you all for coming and listening. And thanks again to Leeds Digital Festival for allowing us to host this great event. It's been a pleasure. Have a great evening.